Hello, everybody. For chapter 42, we're going to be discussing birds. I think it's pretty appropriate with springtime starting to get into the full spring mode here. A lot of the birds I hear every morning starting to really chirp outside. This is one of the times where birds are really starting to come out, build their nests. Very active time for them. So we're going to be talking about their characteristics and how they sort of evolved. So all birds, of course, are going to have feathers. When we look at the genes that cause feathers to grow in birds, they are very similar to the genes that cause scales to grow in things like your reptiles and your fish. These feathers actually have a very similar structure to scales in the way that they grow. We can see a picture over to the bottom left of scales. They grow from pockets in the skin, and they're made out of tough keratin, depending on what the organism is. For feathers, they grow in a similar way. They grow from pockets from the skin. They also are made out of keratin, although it's usually a little bit more flexible. And then they have some extra filament on them, of course, as we can see in the two pictures over to the right, a bird's wing, and then actually a zoomed in under a microscope view of a feather. You can see just how intricate and complicated they are. Feathers, of course, are going to be much more suited for keeping the bird warm and much more suited for flight than scales are. But this is something that the birds do share in common with some of the dinosaurs from a long time ago, and actually it's looking like a lot of our dinosaurs actually evolved feathers as well. Another characteristic that all birds will have would be wings. The bird's forelimbs, their front limbs, like what would be our arms on us, they have been modified into a pair of wings. Even on birds that don't have flight, like penguins, they still have technically wings that they're going to be using more for swimming, of course. When we look back at penguins, it looks like some of their ancestors actually were able to fly, but they became more adapted for swimming. So wings are pretty interesting to look at, especially when we look at the evolution of wings. It looks like some of our dinosaurs, some of our smaller dinosaurs likely had wings. When we look at their fossils, we can see imprints of wings, of feathers, I should say, on their limbs, very similar to wings. There's a dinosaur ancestor to birds called Archaeopteryx that was one of the best examples. It's actually shown in the brown tan picture over to the right. The Archaeopteryx wing is shown kind of in the middle there. It's labeled. That is the wing of a very early ancestor that kind of connects dinosaurs to birds based on the fossils that we find for them and based off of some of the other evidence that we found in birds and in dinosaurs. The skeleton of birds are lightweight and very rigid. So the bones in them, they are very, very lightweight. This helps with their flight. They don't have to be picking up as much body weight when they fly. Also, since their skeleton is so rigid, it moves very well with their muscles. There's no energy being lost when they're moving. So it allows them to fly much more efficiently. We'll also talk later on about their bones being hollow for the most part in many birds. This also gives them a lightweight structure that they're able to use for flight. Birds have endothermic metabolism. So that's what we have. That means that they are warm-blooded. They run a pretty high temperature, actually a higher body temperature than us on average. On average, a bird's body temperature might be between 104 and 106 degrees, where our body temperature averages somewhere around 98, 99 degrees. So they actually burn even more energy than us. And that is one of the things that actually gives them the energy for flight. They burn a lot of energy inside of their bodies, and it gives them the ability to run flight. in order to flap their wings, in order to work those huge chest muscles that they have to have in order to push up against the air and fly. So they have a lot of energy going on inside of them, and they have to eat a lot. They have to eat a lot to supply that burning of the energy. Birds have a very unique respiratory system. It's very, very efficient. It's probably the most efficient of any animal on Earth because they have to get a lot more oxygen into their body in order to power flight. So when we look at their lungs, they actually have all these little extra air sacs that are connected to their lungs that hold extra air and extra concentrated oxygen for them to flight. When you think about humans, for example, when we're running, we know it's very important to breathe, right? You're always trying to make sure you're taking deep breaths, getting full breaths. Birds, we can think of them as being able to take even deeper breaths and holding on to extra air and extra oxygen for later use. Their respiratory system is just, it is fantastic for getting all this oxygen in and keeping it so that they can use it for flight. If they didn't have a respiratory system that was this good, it's likely that they wouldn't be able to fly or fly for very long periods like some birds who migrate do. Another characteristic that we're going to find in all birds is some type of beak, and there's a lot of variety in them. If we look at our little diagram over here, we have a duck, very, very flat beak, not going to be very, aggressive with catching, big prey or anything like that. But we have things like eagles and things that have very sharp beaks that are very, very aggressive and we'll use them for capturing big prey. We have things with huge beaks like the pelican that actually will trap and keep fish and food inside there. We have things with short beaks, long beaks. So the big idea is that all birds are going to have some type of beak that's adapted for what they are eating. No modern bird has teeth. Some of the ancestors to birds, like maybe Archaeopteryx, they did have teeth, but over time, birds have lost them because of their eating habits. They don't really need them. They just kind of use their beak and tear things up with their beak and swallow them whole. Here is a picture of the inside of the beak of a penguin. So you can see some of the ridges and things that it has in there down towards its throat. Remember, penguins are going to be eating a lot of fish, so that's going to be what their beak is most well adapted for. All birds are going to have oviparous reproduction. They're going to show oviparity. This means that they lay amniotic eggs that are encased in a hard calcium-containing shell. So we have lots of pictures. We're probably most familiar with chicken eggs. Those are the most familiar to us. All eggs have that same characteristic for birds. They have that same hard outer shell. Some eggs are very, very small, like those of a robin. I mean, we can see on the collection of eggs over to the right on this slide, all the different sizes and colors we might see in some eggs. Some of them are so tiny, like the size of like little stones, little marbles. But that's something that we're going to see. They all lay eggs. They all have to incubate those eggs for a while. And then eventually they will hatch. Sometimes the nests are up in trees, sometimes they're down on the ground, so there's lots of variety in how they are laid and taken care of. So when we look at how birds evolved, the evidence suggests that birds actually arose from dinosaurs, not really like the dinosaurs you might be thinking of, like the pterodactyl, but they are probably more closely related to smaller types of dinosaurs that originally either lived in trees or ran along the ground and eventually evolved wings for flight. That's what the evidence shows us. So we'll go through some of that evidence in the next couple slides to lay it out for you. So there are many similarities between birds and some of our dinosaurs. The first thing is that birds and dinosaurs appeared to have flexible S-shaped necks. We see that in birds and we see that in dinosaurs. So they share that characteristic. That is a homologous characteristic that shows that they probably shared a common ancestor. Also, They have a unique joint in their ankle, which is highlighted in the yellow on the skeleton picture that just came up. That ankle joint shows up only in birds and some dinosaurs. So that's something else that they share that's very close together and shows relatedness to each other. Also, something that they share is hollow bones. So when we look at the bones of birds, they have these air pockets that are in them. Also, when we look at dinosaur fossils, they also have those air pockets that are in there. Many dinosaurs had hollow bones. So those are three big characteristics that birds and many dinosaurs share, and it indicates that they are closely related to each other. So here is the bone of a dinosaur fossil that has those similar air pockets in there that made their bones light too, probably for running and eventually for flight in some of our dinosaurs. So the earliest flying vertebrates were dinosaurs. They were not birds. So of course you're probably familiar with like the pterodactyl and some other dinosaurs similar to it. Also, it appears that there were some dinosaurs that did have feathers, and some of them developed the ability for flight as well. The oldest known bird fossil that we have found is Archaeopteryx, and we see a picture of its fossil to the left and then an illustration, a drawing of what it probably looked like when it was living. So we can see it sort of looks like a peacock mixed with like a turkey. It had claws on the front of its wings, so that's something that it had in common with dinosaurs and not really today's birds. But its feathers and its wings were very similar to today's birds. It also started to develop a beak that was similar to today's birds. So when we look at those characteristics and some of the genetics behind this, it's likely that Archaeopteryx is the earliest known bird fossil. Now we might find some ones that are earlier that have not been discovered yet, but that's the current information that we have. Archaeopteryx had hollow bones, just like today's birds, and it had a furcula fused pair of collar bones called a wishbone. So a furcula is that bone that sort of holds the wishbone together at the collarbone. So we can, you're probably familiar with that with like a turkey, something like that. Archaeopteryx has this, and the today's modern birds have that wishbone as well. So basically, when we look at Archaeopteryx, it had a wishbone, and today's birds have a wishbone. So that's something that we look at and say that shows that they're closely related to each other. As I said before, feathers are really modified scales, so they grow in a similar way. They serve two primary functions. Number one, they provide lift for flight. So they give the bird more surface area, they're lightweight, they allow it to flap flap their wings in the air and get lift off of that so that they can fly and stay in the air. Also, feathers conserve body heat, they conserve warmth. So they're really good at trapping heat inside for the bird so that the bird does not lose its heat and heat energy as it's flying through cold climates or if it has to go a little while without food. They took the place of scales as the body covering in birds. So it's likely that the pre-bird ancestors, the certain groups of dinosaurs that we're talking about, they had scales to begin with, but over time those scales started to change. They started to evolve in a way that allowed those dinosaurs to maybe glide a little bit, maybe be lifted off the ground a little bit to get away from predators or to catch their prey. And those scales that got better at doing this, those were the scales that allowed the dinosaurs to survive more. So those genes for those changing scales continued to be passed down over time. When you give this hundreds of thousands, millions of years, you can get to the point where you have these big changes taking place from scales over to feathers. Some bird behaviors that we see today, one of the biggest is being preening. It always seems like birds are cleaning themselves. That's important. They need to keep those wings nice and clean so that it helps them fly. If they get dirty and stuck together, they're not going to be able to fly as well. I'm sure we've all seen those sad videos of like birds being covered in oil from like an oil spill. They can't fly because their feathers are all stuck together. So they have to keep those clean. And one of the main ways they do this is by preening. They'll use their beaks to rub their feathers with a certain type of oil that's produced by a preen gland. This gland that produces that oil is usually back towards the tail feathers of the bird. So they'll get some oil from that little gland and then they'll spread it over their wings to clean them. So pretty cool way in which they do that. The bird skeleton is composed of thin, hollow bones, like we've been talking about. The bones are fused together and it's very, very rigid. Okay, it's more rigid than that of a reptile's. So they might be a little bit more fragile, but that rigidity helps them fly better because it helps keep all their bones moving in the same way, the same direction. It's very efficient and it helps them fly. So their bones are more rigid than that of a reptile's and that of other organisms, but there's a reason for that. It helps with their flight. Birds have a very large sternum. This is the breastbone attachment point for their flight muscles. Birds have very large flight muscles that they're going to use in order to travel around. They have to be attached to something. Muscles have to be attached to something. Just like your leg muscles are attached to your bone, your arm muscles are attached back to the bone. The flight muscles, they have to be attached back to something. They're attached back to the breastbone in the chest of birds. Birds also have a structure called a pygostyle. This is a fused terminal vertebrae on the spine. So terminal means it's all the way at the end, and we can see a picture of this down at the bottom right. You can see that fused bone at the very end where the tail feathers would be. This helps support those tail feathers. It helps to add lift with those tail feathers, so it helps it with flying. It adds, or I'm sorry, aids in steering and braking. So it allows the bird to kind of steer a little bit better where it's going to fly, and it allows it to slow down. This is kind of similar to the tail wing of a plane, right? It's kind of designed that same way to help with steering, to help with slowing it down if it needs to. So that's pretty cool. Birds, like we said, have a high metabolism because they are endothermic. So that means that they are producing a lot of energy, a lot of body heat. They can't go for long periods of time without eating. So they often eat things that are pretty easily available, like seeds and insects. Those things are very common and there's a lot of them. So that's going to be what most birds are going to be eating. Of course, your bigger birds, they're going to be eating larger prey, like your eagles and your hawks and falcons, they'll be eating larger things. But most of your birds are smaller, and they're going to be eating your insects and seeds and fruit, things like that. When we look at bird digestion, it doesn't start with really chewing. Birds don't have teeth. They're not able to chew food. But what they do have is something called a crop, which we can see in the diagram down below. This is where food is temporarily stored. Then it moves to the gizzard further down the digestive system, which is where the food's going to be ground up. Some birds are actually going to have small teeth in the gizzard that will grind up the food. Some birds will actually swallow stones and other hard things to keep in that gizzard, in which that'll help grind up the food as well. So that's pretty wild that some of our birds actually have those stones and teeth down in there so that they can grind up food in the gizzard. Birds have a four-chambered heart, very similar to ours. Of course, it's going to be much smaller, but it has those same characteristics of the left and right atrium and the left and right ventricles. We said the respiratory system of birds has to be very efficient for flight. They have to get a lot of oxygen in there. And it's so efficient because we have this system of air sacs that permits birds to have oxygenated air in their lungs during both inhalation and exhalation. So when the birds breathe in, they have a whole bunch of oxygen-rich air in their lungs. Also, when they breathe out, they still have a whole bunch of oxygen in their lungs and in those air sacs. So it keeps extra oxygen in there for them to use to power their muscles and to use for flight. Many birds might have something called a syrinx. This produces songs, and I'll be sending you a little video clip later on of the lyrebird, which actually can make a whole bunch of different noises and mimic things. So we'll take a look at that in one of your video clips later on. The syrinx, of course, is going to be located in the throats near the vocal cords. This allows birds to produce all of the songs that we hear, from chirps to more complicated songs that you might have seen videos of. Relative to their size, birds actually have pretty large brains. You might have heard somebody use as an insult before, you have a bird brain or something like that. That's actually not very accurate when we consider how smart many birds actually are. Take a couple things into example. Flight. Birds have to be able to tell their body to fly. They have to be able to control their flight. They have to know where they're going. Some birds are able to know where they are on Earth by either using the stars or by sensing electromagnetic fields when they're migrating. They have to know how to build nests and take care of their young. There's a lot of things that birds have to be able to do. Their brains are actually pretty complicated for their size. They also have keen, very strong color vision that aids them in finding food. So birds are very drawn by colors, colors of certain berries, seeds, flowers, if they're a type of bird like a hummingbird. All of those things drive them in order to find food. So they're able to see those colors very easily from far away up in the sky. So their vision, actually, a lot of birds have better vision than we do because they have to be able to see really well while they're flying high up in the air. So vision is something that they have a real strong advantage in. Eggs of the birds, they're going to be encased in a hard shell, like we have said. The example that we see over to the top left of bird eggs is something that you're probably used to seeing. Other types of eggs that we find in other organisms, we have amphibian eggs, which are going to be not covered by a hard shell. They're often laid in water. We have a person holding a whole bunch of amphibian eggs, frog eggs probably, in their hand over to the left. And then in the center of this slide, we of course have a reptile egg. We have a reptile, probably a lizard, maybe a snake, being hatched out of there. So that is going to be something that is similar between birds and reptiles. They have that hard egg. They have that hard shell. Birds and amphibians, their eggs are going to be different. Lastly, birds, they have a ability to migrate. A lot of birds actually migrate. So like for example, we have a lot of birds here in the summertime and in the springtime that will migrate when it's the fall and winter to places down south, like South America, where it's warmer. So migration, that's the seasonal movement of animals from one habitat to another. Birds probably travel the furthest distances because they are not bound to just swimming or running. They fly. So they can fly over land and water. They can travel large distances. And that's something that flight has really allowed them to do as well. It's really important for their survival. If birds couldn't fly far distances, they would probably not be able to survive in areas like ours in the winter. Of course, we have birds that migrate here in the winter and do really well here in the winter, but there are a lot of birds in the summer and the spring that if they were to stick around here in the winter, if they weren't able to migrate, they would not survive. So that's something that's really important with birds as well.